It's the climate cause. Hello and welcome to the Climate Cause. I'm Maddie Rez, and I'm interviewing people to explore how they relate to climate change and what they're doing about it. It's going to be another great episode. Thanks for listening. And as always, this episode is made in partnership with Ecological Design Network. Visit their website, ecologicaldesignetwork.com, to find out how they can help you.
So I'm here with Bree Nicolello, who is an urban planner and a policy analyst with over 10 years of experience in working with diverse communities throughout the Pacific Northwest to develop equitable housing and economic development projects and programs. Welcome, Bree.
Hey.
Hey, so happy to and excited to have you here. Our intention today is to learn a little bit more about you and how you connect your climate dots. And we'd also love to hear about the work that you're doing now. And so in great fashion, I am going to open with a question, and it's a pretty big question. What is your motivation for the climate work that you do?
Oh, man. It's so funny. It's not a question I'm asked very much. And so I really appreciate you asking that. So the motivation for the work that I do, honestly, I think has a lot to do with how I grew up in Los Angeles. And so I grew up in a part of LA that one didn't have a lot of transit infrastructure. It was really expensive and it was near a lot of environmental issues. And I really saw firsthand what that meant. One, trying to just like find stable housing, to trying to get from my school to work, and then also too, just like seeing disparities in things like asthma and cancer, even from a super young age. Most of my family works at the Port of Long Beach. And so seeing from a young age the impacts of living next to color, and then also seeing the impacts of one, where folks were living next to areas that tended to be industrial and oil refineries and unsafe. People forget that Southern California is a little bit more like Texas with palm trees. And so seeing that firsthand, and then also too seeing the impacts of gentrification and displacement. And you might be like, wait a second, those are all things that have to do with like affordable housing and like transportation. Like, what does that have to do with climate change? But the thing is, like, when you don't have access to a safe, affordable place to live, when you aren't able to get to and from work safely and affordably, when you don't live next to areas that are, have parks and trees and all things like that, that all is related to climate change. That all has impacts on ensuring that we have healthy lives, healthy cities, that we're able to really think about livability in a holistic fashion. And so my motivation for this work really cut down to seeing those disparities firsthand. And then I didn't even know that there was a job you could do that focused on it. I was so lucky to go to the University of Oregon, and honestly thought I was applying through the Sustainability Center and kind of just like bullshitted my way through an interview with Sustainable Cities Initiative, which happened to be a group that worked on community planning projects with cities all over the state of Oregon. Ended up becoming an international program. And I was like, wow, that's all great. And then I dropped out of school and I worked in the music industry instead. But that was wonderful because what it did was it gave me even more knowledge firsthand about, hey, it's not super livable if you have to drive an hour and a half to get to your job and you're living in a really crappy apartment that you can't afford in Gardena, and you're dealing with the stress of all of that. And so, for me, it was like, wait, there's got to be more than this. These problems, there has to be something I can do around these things. And when it was time for me to go back to school and go back to University of Oregon, I asked for my old job back there and kind of started to learn more about this. And I was like, okay, I think there's like a thing here. I'm not really sure what it is. I don't really know what it looks like, but I just want to like try this planning thing. I'm not good at math. I think they want me to do that. And it ended up being just like this perfect, amazing thing. And I got really involved in transit advocacy and housing advocacy. I got to do some really cool stuff. I've been in love with this field ever since. It's to truly say that I love what I do, and I love that it's important work and that I get to help people and work with really phenomenal, folks in so many communities across the Northwest.
Totally. I really, really appreciate the backstory and just like the true like vulnerability and transparency that you shared of like your own experiences and going through, connecting those dots of when you were younger and seeing how your environment shapes you and how it shapes life for others. And then I too worked for the Sustainable Cities initiative, and that had been a huge opportunity for me to start to realize how we live is intersectional with everything else that's going on, and how vital it is to put intentional work in the transportation system, in the housing system, into our food systems, into everything that shapes how you truly feel in the place that you are, right? And so I think that what really sticks out to me in your story is like, you were able, from your experience has like connected you to the spaces that you've lived, and you've been motivated to positively affect those, not only for yourself, but more importantly, and it sounds like more prioritized wise, like the community around you. And so now flash forward, it's 2021, and you are working for an organization that you call ACHD, which is the African Community Housing and Development, where you are a director of programs. I'd love to hear, like, now here you are, how are you taking this motivation, this climate motivation, into your work? Like what is the tool that you use, and why do you believe in it?
Yeah. Well, so let me share a little bit more about the organization I work with. So I work for a pretty much entirely community-led organization based in South King County. Our organization serves predominantly folks from East Africa who are immigrants and refugees. Though we serve, anybody who comes through our doors, but that's kind of our particular focus. And the organization was started actually 15 years ago at a property over in unincorporated King County called Skyway. There's a lot of East African immigrants and refugees who live there. And the folks who started this organization, Hamdi Abdul is our executive director, and our housing manager, Chief Aiden Hussein, they met actually organizing there and putting together tenant advocacy work, putting together after school programs, and making sure that folks had access to resources. And then the organization that I work for now, African Community Housing and Development, is the result of 15 years, almost 2 decades of organizing work by members of that community. And I got brought on as their 4th employee, and it was because I had been working with them previously on consulting for community development work, and they were looking for somebody of my particular background. I kind of do like a little bit of everything. So I got to kind of be a jack of all trades and just know a little bit enough about different things, and then thankfully get somebody in there who knew more what I was doing, including like writing an HR policy. I was like, I don't know what I'm doing here. But we were able to find somebody at some point who could take that on. And so at this point now, I work pretty much exclusively on our community development program and on our rent assistance and social services program. And so we provide full wraparound services, including social services, education, and then we also provide rent assistance programs. We have a seniors program, and then we also have our community development work. And I really love how our associate director, Bill and Aiden, puts it. We, don't have the luxury to only focus on the future. We have to also deal with the issues folks are facing right now. And so for us, again, like we see no separation as an organization in our fight towards climate justice. When we are also advocating for tenant rights and making sure that people can stay in their homes and not get displaced. We, see that just to be as important as building a really awesome, totally sustainable, gorgeous community development project. And so for the work that we're doing right now, we do a couple different tools in order to make sure that we're meeting our, climate justice goals, and we're also serving our community. And so as part of that, again, it comes down to making sure that renters have access to services so they can advocate for a safe home that's free of things like black mold and pests and things like that, making sure they don't get evicted. Displacement has been an enormous issue up here in King County, especially as COVID, especially as the moratorium ends. The eviction moratorium ending is going to displace a tremendous amount of people, predominantly low-income folks and people of color. And so it's critical for us to be working on that, to make sure that those folks don't get displaced even farther away from the places where they work and live and play, their kids go to school. That is critical. Other ways we work towards that is our education program, where we work with young kids to help train them and teach them, and also learn from them to be leaders in their community around issues just like this. And then last but not least, our community development, and making sure that we have culturally relevant, sustainable development that actually serve the communities that we're building for and with. And this is really, I really want to emphasize that, because I think a lot of community development work can end up being led by white mainstream agencies, and aren't really truly in partnership. And so I think that's a really critical issue, especially in that particular field. And so what does it actually mean to have like a truly community-led development? And so we're really exploring that as well, and find that to be absolutely critical. If people don't have affordable, safe places to live, just like, what I spoke about with renters, what are we even doing, right? And so it's all, tools that we're using to help further these efforts and really try and change the current status of things here in King County. I mean, King County is an area that has seen, again, enormous gentrification, enormous displacement. And those folks are going to get displaced further away. We're seeing clients get displaced as far down as like Puyallup, which is below Tacoma. I mean, that's an hour and a half away and 1,000,000 miles away from communities that people also need to be near. Because at the end of the day, when we talk about displacement, we talk about gentrification, it's not just like somebody now has to drive like 90 minutes to 2 hours to get to their job. Like, that's bad. But we're also talking about how communities are getting fractured, and you're having people get displaced from family members, from schools, from businesses, from places that are really deeply important to them. And that has an even further impact in their, just frankly, just like happiness and safety and security. I mean, those are deeply critical things. And I think that emotional side of it, we don't always talk about as much either. We talk about livability as like this really kind of like policy, sexy catch-all word. And it's like, let's really talk about what that means though. Like, that means that like, I'm going to be able to come home to a place that feels good, that I can afford, in a community I care about, that cares about me. And, when we think about it, we can feel so removed from those conversations of, livability and climate justice, but that's really what it is at the end of the day. It's that everybody deserves to have that feeling of coming home,
Yeah, absolutely. And I really appreciate like you speaking so in depth about how these things interplay, and the systems that we have currently in place, these status quo, there's a reason that they're not working, because there's so many people and factors in if we're going to speak as widely as the natural environment, but talking about here, we're talking about humans, and we're talking about like innate rights of feeling safe and having shelter and having access to our community. The community is the place where we come together and want to feel that those feelings of safety, and also in terms of the wider picture of like how we all fit into this planet together. It starts with, how do I fit in my community, and do I feel like a place here? And I think that specifically in these communities that you've talked about. Like, what the quote that you had said was extremely powerful. Like, we don't have the luxury of planning for the future. And I think that the systems that we have in place have brought these communities in particular to these points where the luxury that many people of higher income have is to, it's just like, oh, like, let me hashtag like climate action, or let me do what I can in my free time. Whereas in reality, like, living is an aspect of in a relationship with your environment. And so I think that that's like a really powerful vision of how you're saying how this like livability meshes with housing and meshes with our communities, because I totally agree. And I dream of these like super futuristic cities, right? With like little scooters and interconnected transportation. And the goal here is like efficiency and higher levels of like quality of life. But the reality is we don't have that luxury. We have to be realistic with where we're at. And I think that's one of my intentions of creating this production is like there's so many dots to connect that it feels so all the topics feel so apart, but in reality the solutions are mixed. They're related so heavily.
Yeah, and I think that like a couple of things to like parse in that too, and it's why I love that our associate director Billin said that, because it was just such a salient thing to think, and such a salient thing to say. And I bring it up probably in like every single community development meeting I'm in, where I'm like, because it's such a critical thing. And I think for planning, for urban policy, the majority of people who are in this field are like us. They're white, they are relatively privileged, and they view this through a very specific lens. And it's like, okay, I have to create this 20-year plan, and these metrics are going to be defined this way. And somebody, if they talk to me about this, has to use these terms. And so we do all of this, like, just like exclusionary work, even just within the profession, to keep people out, particularly communities of color, folks with disabilities, Indigenous communities, and a lot more queer communities. I mean, the city is very much designed for white men and for folks who are of higher income. And so, and the way we approach it is a reflection of that, right? And so I think that one of the biggest things too is like communities of color in particular, Indigenous communities, have been having conversations about climate change for generations. And so it's something too where it's like, I think a lot of like white mainstream planning communities will also dismiss those folks because they're maybe not necessarily using the same language or using, terms that we've deemed acceptable. And so the accessibility of these conversations is really limited. And I think you see that, for example, conversations around like growth management. King County, I really appreciate that there was an effort to create equity as part of the growth management work that the regional council here is doing. And I really want to commend that work. And at the same time, that work is so technical and so inaccessible. And so it's like, how do we actually have these conversations? And they need to be led by communities that are impacted. And those communities have been doing this work and thinking about this for decades and decades and generations and generations. And so, how can we shift, frankly, the thing that really matters, which in this case is shifting funding and power to out of these, kind of planning circles that are predominantly white and mainstream, and getting it into to be directly led by communities who are impacted. And I think that, especially right now with all of the federal funding that's coming out, this is the time to do that. There is money, there is funding. Let communities lead, really critical as a tool. And it's not going to look like what a white mainstream planner wants it to look like. And folks have to get over that. I mean, it's just kind of what it is. And so I really see that, especially with a lot of like community development applications and things like that, where it's like, oh, you have to have like this, and this, and you need to talk about it in this way and this way. And it's like, if you really want truly community-led development, you have to actually make this process accessible. And that means like actually supporting people through this and providing the tools and the resources and the financial resources people need. And then actually making sure that you can design these kinds of processes and design, these systems to actually be accessible. And that has to be a process led by communities. And so I think for all of those things, like, the way we approach these issues, it dramatically needs to change.
It's radical in a sense of really challenging these systems that we have, because I think that going back to this like status quo, especially with community planning, and it's look to the set of tools that they have, as opposed to what the communities have, or how the community wants to shape the outcomes. Because I think that there's disconnect. Communities have been asking for so long and keen to these issues. I guess I'm wondering how have you been able to engage your community? Like, what does that look like in terms of the outcomes of the projects and programs that you work on?
Yeah, well, I think that to pick up on what you were saying earlier, it's like not just like for because I want to speak to that in terms of, I think, community development work in particular, and like climate work, it's not just like sharing a mic, it's just like giving the mic entirely and the stage and like the whole entire thing. It's just letting go of that and letting folks lead. And I think oftentimes planners and policymakers can struggle with how to do that, but oftentimes it comes with just like, let communities do their work in the way that they want to try and do. People know what's going on in their community. People know what they want to see change. That could be, folks who want to see, oh gosh, I don't even know. I mean, it's like, it could really be anything. It's like, it's one of those things where it's like, we need to really just sometimes, I think, on the, especially like for those of us who are in this field who come from a really white mainstream background and perspective, it's just like knowing when to just like step out of the way. And that's a lot more, I think, than a lot of people in the field care to admit. And so there's that piece. I think in terms of your question around, was it around community specifically, or?
Yeah, like how have you handed over the mic?
Yeah. So I think that what's really interesting is like, so I work at an organization that's pretty much entirely community led. And specifically when I talk about communities, in this case, I'm talking about members of the East African immigrant and refugee community. And so when I say community led in this case, I'm talking specifically like our board, our leadership, the majority of our staff are of East African descent, and many who are here are first generation immigrants and refugees. And so when I took this job, I was really nervous about working in a community-led organization, because I just came from a pretty like white mainstream nonprofit. And so I was just like, I don't want to like get in the way. And I really want to be able to like support, but like, what does it mean to like be like, I'm on our leadership team, and it's like, what does that mean? And so the way that like I've approached this is, it's like, I'm here at the invitation of the community that I serve, and I'm going to be here until hopefully they don't have a need for me anymore. My job is to train my replacement. And so I want to, work with our leadership team to build capacity and, help build that expertise around this kind of work. And then I'm going to exit, because I shouldn't be leading a community development department. I'm not from this community. And so it should really be somebody who's, from the communities that we serve and are led by, especially for something like community-led development. So, after that capacity is built, I'm going to exit and I'm going to go do something else. Don't know what that is. Don't know when that's going to be. But, I think that I talk about with our executive director, it's like doing like the 30-day gut check. And it's like, okay, are we like, where are we at with everything? And what's like, where are we going to go? And is it time yet for, me to leave, or where are we at? And that time's going to hit. I hope it hits sooner rather than later, not because I don't love working here, but because it means that I've been able to like do my job and I'll do something else. But yeah, I think that's the big thing is like, for me, my goal is to always train, and build capacity so I can kind of get myself out of a job and have somebody else come in to be able to lead that work. And that was really the approach I had with my consulting practice too. It was just like, when I was consulting, it's like, look, like my role is to not be like the keeper of how to do this. Like my role is to help build that capacity in folks. And then, you've got it and you can run with it and do your own thing.
No, absolutely. And I think that's such important work. So thank you for doing that, especially in all the capacities that you've been able to build capacity for, I guess, doubled using the word. It happens. But yeah, so just in closing, I'd love to hear about, or I'd love if you could answer the question of like, what is something that you think is misunderstood or misemphasized about the work that you do?
Yeah. I think that right now, as climate change is defined as like an ideology and a concept, as kind of has been the theme in like my comments, is white and mainstream led. And so it's really focused on, especially when we think about climate change, it's kind of focused on like, okay, we think of like greenhouse emissions, like greenhouse gas emissions. We think of like recycling and things like that. When we think of like the home and, our community, we think of, especially like, I think of like individual stuff, like I'm going to compost. And again, like I'm going to recycle. And like those things are super cool and super great. But like one, as I'm sure many other fabulous folks, I always think of like Kelsey's Livor, and other folks I know who have like done some really great speaking around this, around just like one, individual responsibility is oftentimes how we define climate change. And like, we need to hold people, particularly corporations, accountable, and government systems and things like that. But especially too, it's like, that is a pretty privileged way if that's like the extent that you see climate change in your home, because that means that you're not maybe living in a floodplain, or you live in a place with fire hazard, because you couldn't afford to live near the city, and you're living in an area on the urban fringe, and your home might catch on fire. Or maybe you live super in the city and you don't have any trees or parks, so your home is hot and you don't have a way to safely escape the heat. Or maybe you have unsafe drinking water, which is an issue that plagues a lot of this country, or unsafe like wastewater infrastructure, which is a huge issue. There was a massive article in the New York Times earlier this month about a community that literally has sewer water flooding up their pipes in people's homes. Also issues around access to safe living conditions, both around like things like mold, which could cause asthma, lead paint, issues around being located near, industrial activities that can also result in things like increased cancer rates and asthma and things like that. So again, like when we think about the home, like the home is really the nexus of where all of those things come together. And so if all you look at in your home and you're thinking is like, oh, I need to like recycle more, like you're pretty privileged. That's a really privileged way of getting to look at climate change. And like, I think that that's the thing, is like, we need to start thinking about it in more of these radical ways where it's just like, hey, this is something that impacts a lot of people in very, very personal, very deep ways, to the point where, again, it's impacting that home. And that's even why, of course, as I mentioned earlier, things like renters' rights and affordable housing and, safe homes are so critical to fighting against climate change, because at the end of the day, like that is what is going to help us actually move the needle on that. It's people having safe, affordable, accessible places to live. And so if we always think about it as like this thing that kind of exists in like the ether around us, I don't think we're ever really going to get anywhere with it. But if we really realize and look at it as this thing that is really individual, that does impact our home, especially, you know, if you're somebody who maybe hasn't experienced the issues I, you know, described, maybe, you know, you live in a place that's relatively safe and affordable and isn't near those things. Like, you know, I hope that that can kind of show that it's like these issues are so, again, so deep and so personal. So, you know, I think that this really gets back to how we approach these issues and think about the way that like privilege informs them, right? It's like the privilege of being a single issue voter. Like if you're just like, this single issue defines me, like this is all I care about, it's like, that's privilege, man. Like that's you being able to only focus on one issue. And just like that, like just like our issues that face the majority of people out there are really complex and really interconnected and really complicated. Like so are the solutions that define them. And I think that's really like where community and having truly community-led efforts is so key, is because, you know, you want it to always be by community and for community. So thank you so much for having me. It was such a pleasure to see you again and speak with you. And thank you for just the ability to like chat about these like really critical things. And I'm just like so excited to see this podcast and where it goes, man. It's so exciting.
Oh, thanks. I'm so excited too. And I'm just so grateful that once again, we got, you know, we've connected in the past and we were able to just, you know, keep in touch, as well as you were able to join me so late on a Thursday evening. And like, I am just grateful too that we were able to like gab about this. I'm so privileged, you know, to be able to be sitting here and sharing these stories and connecting these dots in a way that, is like creative and takes time and is curated. And I definitely am I'm just really sitting here reflecting on that. And so thank you for joining, Bree. And I hope that we're keeping in touch. So thanks everyone for listening, and we'll catch you next time. All right. Well, thanks.
Thanks for listening to a lengthy but could be lengthier discussion on the climate cause. Check out the show notes and/or visit our website, The Climate Cause, for more information. Follow us on your socials and check out the ecologicaldesignnetwork.com. Thanks!